Chapter 8 Sawadi, Friend. The savants almost ran. Their usual pace in itself is rapid enough, but now, urged on by the thrill of their great find, they moved forward at an even faster pace. Norma endured the forced march for a while until I resolved to say something. Ureta transmitted my message, and contrary to what I expected, the captain slowed down without even casting a glance in our direction. The warriors ahead of us and behind us took the occasion to make fun of us, not because Norma was not following behind them all, which is the normal thing for the women to do, but because here was a wife who imposed her will upon her husband. A kind of frigidity surrounded us. We were alone and isolated completely from the camaraderie we had become accustomed to when we camped. They lit the fire and did not invite us to share it. If we wanted warmth, we would have to get our own firewood. Even Ureta and Sabre now shared the feelings of their tribal brothers. They did not talk to us, and when we approached them, they shunned us. When we were near, they lapsed into a sullen silence, as if contact with us compromised them in some way. At nightfall, one of the natives remained on guard. If for some reason we moved away from the campsite, he would follow us and watch us to see what we were doing. I did not say a word to Norma about it, but I harbored the gravest fears as to how we would be received in the parent village. This was the opportunity for which we had worked so hard and endured so much. It was seemingly an inevitable danger from which there appeared no way out. We were now being confronted by brutal, primitive reality. My civilized mind had not yet fully accepted the situation which faced us. It rebelled against the fact that in the middle of the 20th century the Stone Age should emerge to dominate. But it was the truth, and it was this that we had come here to seek. Civilization and its prodigious advances were a remote and scarcely credible tale in this environment where primitive man reigned with all the prerogatives of an absolute monarch. We had proved that in the jungle everything happens unexpectedly, when one thinks least likely occurs. What one thinks least likely occurs. We had imagined that before setting eyes on the legendary parent village, we would glimpse it from a distance, or at least that we would know we were coming to it by signs and traces left by the inhabitants of a great village. We left the path fringed by the jungle and had hardly begun to cross an area of reddish sand when we both uttered an exclamation in unison. About half a mile ahead there stood out, as if defying history, the native village which had given rise throughout the hemisphere to more legends and more literature than anything else. It was, as we had supposed, an important and imposing village in comparison with all others we had seen before. From where I was, I could not estimate its size very accurately, but along the extent of one side of its semicircle formation, I counted from 20 to 30 large dwellings. As a background, it had the monumental mountain range El Roncador. A whole string of fantastic tales came feverishly to our minds. How many white men had paid with their lives without ever enjoying, even for a moment, the privilege that was ours. This was the key to the most populous and famous warrior tribe in South America. Suddenly I felt belittled, humbled, as though I were before something outside of this world. It was early afternoon, and for that reason, presumably, there was not much activity. The warriors dumped their loads on the track, including the baskets and mats containing game. and one of them set off at a trot towards the village. A kind of barking sound came to meet him and reached our ears clearly. The Indian responded in the same manner and went on running. We had not walked 50 yards more before Indians began to pour out of the huts. Their silence was impressive. They gave no outward sign of recognition, uttered no shouts as they lined the road. They all carried arms. There must have been some 300 warriors. They were bedaubed with red paint, wore the classic adornments, and were stark naked. Their arrogance was manifest. Some of them evinced scorn, some hate, some curiosity. None made any friendly gesture. There were no women or children among them. Two exceedingly aged Indians with parchment-like features and white hair opened their toothless mouths to shout something at us. As we passed, we left a trail of whispering behind us. We made our way towards the place where the tribal council met and took to one of the numerous paths that crossed it. When we reached the front of one hut, which was bigger than the rest, a savant came out, followed by some 15 other Indians. Neither his ornaments nor the paint he wore indicated that he was any different from the rest. Yet, in spite of that, he had an air of authority. He looked at us for some seconds, and forthwith required Ureta to furnish his report. Meanwhile, the warriors crowded behind us. His countenance remained impassive during the whole of Ureta's dissertation. I had often imagined the suspense I would endure at being face to face with the chief of the savants. But now, in the presence of the most famous of all the native chiefs, whom very few had ever seen at close quarters, I forgot that he had our lives in his hands, and I studied him attentively. His features were regular and rather square, remarkable for a high forehead and slightly aquiline nose. His mouth and lips were well proportioned, but not the chin, which was firm and prominent. Most savants have lively, sparkling eyes, but their chief's eyes were serene, giving the impression in response of a clear-sighted and exceptional intelligence. A bull neck and an extremely vigorous body completed the picture that presented itself to my cautious and summary inspection. As Ureta concluded his speech, one electrifying word ran through the tribe: peon, woman. As before, my wife wore trousers and hid her hair under a pith helmet, and the tribe's first look had taken her for a man. I had already noted the presence, half concealed, of a number of women. When the word mentioned by the men reached their ears, they drew near to gaze at Norma. At my suggestion, she took off her pith hat, and immediately there was a fresh outburst of loud comment. Some old warriors, who were showing visible signs of disapproval at the behavior of the women, addressed them in thunderous tones, which made them scuttle to the huts. I cleared my throat and delivered myself of a speech addressed to the chief, which I had prepared beforehand and rehearsed many times. I got it all off in one go, and without stammering or hesitating. It was an expression of the truth. I told him that I came from a tribe that dwelt a very long way off, because even to there the reputation of such valiant warriors as his had spread, and so I wished to meet them. He took this quite naturally. If all the neighboring tribes feared and respected him, there was no reason why the attitude of my tribe should be otherwise. He put his right hand on my left shoulder and exclaimed, "Sawadi, friend." Then he took my wife and me by the hand and led us inside his hut. The light coming in through the doorway and through the ventilation holes at floor level enabled us to see fairly well. He bade us sit down on a new mat, and he himself sat in the middle. He joined our hands with his own and intoned a mournful and loud ritual moan. Swaying gently as he did so, the warriors who accompanied him surrounded us, together with several women. The lugubrious chant went on monotonously for several minutes, but without any diminution of the original strong emotionalism, which Norma obviously found very moving. I was thinking that it could not possibly all be solved so easily. When the ceremony was over, the chief cast aside formality. He leapt to his feet, smiled at us, and told us the names of his 18 children, who were those who stood around us, and his 3 wives. To reciprocate his affability, I gave him a box containing gifts. Indifferently, he put it aside without opening it, and pointed out to us a place where we could accommodate our equipment. Hardly had we turned round when he went into raptures over the gifts. He emptied the box on the mat and was examining the presents inquisitively. He kept the sweet things and some machetes, and distributed the remainder among his sons and other members of his family. I glanced around me at our environment, but without much concentration. I was worried about the very simplicity of the welcome we had been given. Norma, apparently far from sharing my thoughts, was taking in every detail of the large hut that we were to share with the most powerful chief of the Zavant tribes. The mats and other belongings of the families who lived in it were laid out in the usual way against the inside wall. In the center, some tree branches sticking into the ground served to hang up plaited fiber bags filled with maize, or a small brown bean, which had the same appearance as maize. Set before the limit of the space allotted to each family unit, there was a gourd of water. Over everything hung a suffocating smoke, caused by the quantity of coconut shells burning in the tribal fire. The strong smell of burning wood and the uricum saturated the atmosphere. To have more freedom, I chose a place well away from where the chief was. It was a nook in front of the doorway, through which blew a cooling breeze, and it was the place where they dumped unused articles. There was an accumulation of poronkos and gourds, mats, and firewood. I asked the chief's permission to use this space, and he consented, ordering 2 of his sons to shove out of the way anything that bothered me. As they did so, the dust that had settled on the things choked us and fouled the contents of our knapsacks. Our eyes streaming and our throats dry with dust, we sat down to have lunch. Since daybreak, not a bite of food had passed our lips. The midday meal had been postponed on account of the rapidity with which events had developed as we approached the parent village. The chief went out, together with his sons, in the huge dwelling. There were now only women, and 1 warrior who I noticed was eyeing us watchfully. As we sat down on the mat, all our weariness, nervousness, and emotion suddenly took hold of us. Our appetites had evaporated for the time being. Until that moment we had not realized how terribly exhausted we were. Norma smiled at me wanly, her features showing the strain of those arduous marches. Her cheeks and forehead were covered with dust. I must have presented a similar appearance. I have no idea how long we remained in that same position. Just resting, my mind dismissed the thought of danger, and at last I began to examine from where I was everything concerned with the strange existence that was to be opened up for us from now on. My eyes, now accustomed to the smoke and the shadows, were able to make out the small compartment set aside for lovers. It was completely shut in by palm leaves except for the roof, and had been erected where the darkness was most intense for the young lover to visit his betrothed with the consent of the parents, and there, isolated and safe, they could indulge their love-making. she uninhibited by surrounding relatives, and he so that, as a warrior, he should not be seen engaging in emotional pursuits unbecoming to a savant. Lost in these reflections, I did not notice the chief standing beside me. His toe made me flush with embarrassment at having allowed myself to be surprised by his approach. I was at that moment the representative of the white tribe, and I had to live up to those things which the savants valued if I hoped to win their trust and friendship. The chief did not wait for us. I smiled at Norma to give her encouragement. She responded with her customary warmth and said, "Are you scared?" "No," I said. "What is there to be scared about? The chief has given us his okay, and he's the boss around here." I tried to impart to my words a note of confidence, but they sounded hollow even to me. Sure, I was scared. The chief, it was true, was not against us, but if in the tribal council they opted for putting us to death, he was certainly not likely to stand out against them. I asked myself whether I had ever seriously considered such a contingency. No, it had honestly never struck me that we might be coldly judged and condemned by the bellicose savants. The possibility of violent death, of course, had not been entirely absent from our conjectures, but this kind of calculated uncertainty I would have regarded as alien to these tribes of hunters, and as a matter of fact it was. Our situation was a very special one, Norma's sex being one preponderant factor, and our expedition strength only two components another. All these things passed through my mind in the time it took us to walk a dozen yards. As I stepped outside, I was petrified. The whole tribe was assembled in wide circles around a central one, that of the tribal council. Once again the silence was most moving. It was a profound, menacing hush. A child breaking open a coconut against a stone struck a note of brutal indifference. The women were leaning against the palm leaves of the huts in a squatting or sitting posture, not speaking. The heat of the sun was still intense. The range of El Roncador was edged with metallic gilded spangles. The air was still. There was no doubt that the tribe had foregathered much earlier than usual because of us. The warriors looked fixedly ahead of them, their heads slightly bowed. Their spears stood by their shoulders, plunged into the ground. I resolved that the best thing to do, both in relation to the savants and for Norma's sake, was to affect indifference, which was very far from what I really felt. If I expressed my misgivings to her, they would not be likely to make her feel any better. Luckily, the uncertainty of our fate at that moment did not preclude the interest I always felt towards the Indians. The chief indicated to my wife a place in the first circle of warriors. I went on with him to the most important one, the circle of the tribal council itself. When we reached it, he took the deerskin off the tree trunk on which it lay and offered it to me to sit upon, as if to show publicly that I enjoyed his protection. A number of old men clicked their tongues in disapproval. When the chief sat down, one ancient fellow stood up, and gesticulating spear in hand, pointed to me in fury and burst into loud speech. Evidently he had no time for white men. When he finished, others took his place. The bitterest enemies we had were the elderly savants. When a warrior who, through captivity or valor, had attained to a captaincy, a henchman to the chief, and therefore a seat on the council, rose to speak. He did so circumspectly and without irritation. From where I sat, I could see Norma between the heads of the warriors. Being separated like this was torture. I tried not to think and to concentrate my senses so as to grasp the conversations of those on whom our lives depended. It was useless. The whiteness of my wife's shirt, outstanding among the bronzed warriors on either side of her, drew my eyes irresistibly towards her. Possibly she had an inkling of my anxiety, for she took off her pith helmet and, shrugging her shoulders, gave me to understand that she was all right. This only added to my desperation. Now I was sure her nerves must be undergoing a great emotional strain. I constrained myself as best I could and tried to adapt myself to the inexpressiveness of the warriors on the council. They seemed to come to life only when they swatted with a swipe of the hand. An enormous gadfly whose sharp bite feels like a branding iron. My ideas were incoherent. The uneasiness that gripped me concerning Norma prevented me from thinking clearly. We had several enemies on the council who, with flashing glances, told us we were not wanted in the parent village. Maybe these were the last moments of my life, and here I was, wasting them in sorrowful thoughts. Then it struck me that the camera might be the message telling what had befallen us for the information of future expeditions. That obsession caused me to distract the chief's attention and to try to make use of a subterfuge. I pointed to Norma and I told him I would like to see her with this thing. This thing was the sign camera. Doing as I told him, he put his eye to the viewfinder, and without the slightest display of surprise or excitement at what he saw, he answered me with a dry affirmative. I had hardly begun to run a film of the warriors and Norma when I had to stop filming. The slight sound made by the apparatus had caused one of the captains of the council to stop speaking. All the council members were hanging on that sound, which was unknown to them, and they condemned it. Before the chief made an imperative sign to me, the camera had vanished into the case again. No sooner had the blue of the sky eclipsed the declining sun than they kindled the great council fire of tree trunks. From fiber bundles which they held between their legs, the Indians took flat round loaves made from maize and began to eat them. That gave me an idea. I asked the chief if I might go to the hut to have a meal. For some seconds his inscrutable countenance was turned towards his maize loaf. I was afraid he was going to offer it to me, but evidently he thought better of it and gave me the authority I sought, keeping the bread for himself. As I withdrew, walking among youthful warriors, gestures of hatred and scorn passed from one to another. The hours I had been in the council had seemed like an eternity. A savant of the chief's escort, the same one who had kept an eye on us in the hut, accompanied me. So I concealed my true feelings as I found myself once more by Norma's side. She was in a pitiful state. On account of the heat, perspiration had soaked her clothing and made streaks in the dust on her face. I cursed myself for my foolhardiness in having allowed her to talk me into bringing her with me on this expedition. I had to help her to walk, for her legs had become numbed. When we got inside the hut, out of earshot of the warrior who remained at the entrance, she allowed a sob to escape her. Her nerves could not take any more of the terrible tension to which they were being submitted. This was one of the most tremendous experiences for me. This unburdening of her feelings lasted only a few minutes, however. Then she tried to smile, and she asked me what I would fancy to eat. That was my girl. That was what I had always admired in her. A little later I was eating, more to please her than because I really wanted to. The savant women, remaining aloof from us, were getting supper ready, roasting meat on the crackling fire and toasting corn. Norma reclined on one of the hammocks we had hung up and dozed. I preferred to squat on the floor and wait for news. Although we were under cover, it was fairly cold. As the women moved about, their shadows were cast in ghostly manner upon the walls like an ill omen. One of them, whose hair was shorn as a sign of mourning, tripped over a puppy which had been falling at her feet and split a gourd of water. She picked the creature up, but instead of beating it, she pushed it against one of her breasts and let it suck at her nipple greedily. There was no doubt this was a strange world we had entered, and a strange thing it was, too, in this century of modern wonders, to be awaiting the decision of a savage tribe to know whether we were to live or die. How many hours had gone by since we went to the council meeting? My watch had stopped. I guessed it might be 7 or 8 hours. For some time the women had been asleep, and some of the warriors were keeping them company. From time to time the crying of a baby broke the silence. The fire in the center of the hut was nothing but embers now. It was growing colder. A dog came up to me to see who I was. As soon as he sniffed me, he growled fiercely. Almost instantly, from somewhere in the hut, a log came hurtling, striking the animal and causing it to flee amid yelps of pain. I had begun to nod when I noticed the chief come in, together with some warriors. He threw off a deerskin that was covering his shoulders and went to warm himself at the fire, which 2 of the natives had busied themselves reviving. He glanced in my direction and then came towards me. I had been wishing that this meeting might be put off for a few hours more. My mind was in no condition to face up boldly to adversity. He pulled a handful of corn from the bags, and offering it to me, said, "Sawidi." I did not know what to say in reply, nor was it necessary to seek for the right words. He had gone back to the fire. I could not restrain myself from waking Norma to convey news to her that we had been accepted. It was an experience I was not keen to live through again, even though our dreams were now about to become reality. For the first time in history, 2 white people, a man and woman, had managed to get beyond the pale of death surrounding the savant's parent village, and were actually going to be permitted to live among them.